I still remember the night like it was a dark stain on the canvas of my life, a single hour that unraveled everything I thought I knew. I was lying in bed, the hum of the city outside our window blending with the quiet rhythm of our apartment, when I first felt it, an unfamiliar absence, a hollow echo in the spaces that used to be filled with trust. She came in late, her footsteps lighter than usual, almost careful, and I froze, sensing something had shifted. The air felt different, charged, almost electric, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I wanted to ask her where she had been, but a strange hesitation kept me silent. My chest tightened, a cold weight settling there that I couldn't explain. It started with the little things, the subtle cracks that I had been too blind, or perhaps too in love to notice. Her phone would light up across the room, and she would mask the sudden tension with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I convinced myself it was work, that she was tired, that I was imagining it. But deep down, a seed of suspicion took root, and it refused to die. I remember one evening standing in the kitchen, watching her laugh at a message I could not read, and feeling an unfamiliar pang, a quiet, piercing betrayal. I wanted to ask her about it, to demand honesty, but even the thought made my voice falter. I began keeping track of small details, little inconsistencies that once would have seemed inconsequential. A lipstick stain on a collar, the scent of a perfume that was not mine, a hurried glance when I entered the room. Each one whispered a question I wasn't ready to hear. I found myself replaying memories in my head, trying to remember the first time I sensed something was off. Was it a change in the way she looked at me? A shift in her laughter? Or had I always ignored the signs, convincing myself that love could cover all cracks? The truth was gnawing at me, but I clung to the illusion that it wasn't real, that my life wasn't about to be uprooted. Sleep became a stranger. At night, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining scenarios I would rather not name. Every time the door clicked behind her, my heart would jump, imagining her presence elsewhere, imagining her sharing secrets that weren't meant for me. My mind became a labyrinth of doubt, twisting every word, every gesture into evidence of a betrayal I had not yet confirmed. Then came the night that changed everything. I don't remember why I felt the need to follow her, to see the truth with my own eyes. It wasn't a conscious decision, not really. It was instinct, a dark, trembling curiosity that refused to be denied. I watched from the shadows as she entered a building I did not recognize, her steps hurried, purposeful. My stomach twisted into knots. I waited, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then, through a partially open window, I saw him. The sight seared into my memory. The casual intimacy, the familiarity in her gestures that had once been reserved only for me. I couldn't look away, though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to hide, to deny. But denial was no longer an option. That night, something inside me fractured, and the man I had been, the husband, the believer in forever, was replaced by someone raw, trembling, and profoundly unmoored. In the days that followed, life became a distorted reflection of itself. I went through the motions: work, home, conversations, meals, all painted with a thin veneer of normalcy. But underneath, everything was trembling. Every touch, every word, every glance from her felt like a threat. I became hyper-aware, scanning for signs, replaying the moment I had seen over and over, as if by repeating it I could somehow undo it. I tried to speak to her, to confront her gently at first, searching for the reasons, the explanations. But she deflected, smiled, and offered vague reassurances that only deepened the chasm between us. Her calmness became another torment. The ease with which she moved through our home was a cruel reminder that she had been living a parallel truth that I had no access to. My friends noticed the change. I was quieter, more withdrawn, the laughter that once came easily now a rare and brittle thing. I pretended it was stress, work, exhaustion, anything to avoid the unavoidable confession. But alone, I wrestled with thoughts I never wanted to confront. I imagined conversations, confrontations, apologies that would never come. My own guilt, though misplaced, gnawed at me. Had I missed something? Was there something in me that drove her away? And yet, beneath the rage, the confusion, and the heartache, a strange clarity began to emerge. The world I had built, The illusions I had clung to were not real. I had loved a version of her that existed only in my mind, not the complex, flawed human woman in front of me. The betrayal was hers, yes, but the blindness had been mine. I began to see the threads of my own complacency woven through the fabric of our life, threads that had enabled deception to grow unnoticed. Even now, months later, I struggle to articulate the moment when acceptance began to replace despair. It wasn't sudden, not cinematic in the way films make such realizations appear. It was incremental, subtle, painful, a recognition that life would never be the same, but that there was a life still worth navigating. I started noticing details I had ignored, the quiet resilience of my own mind, the capacity to endure, the flickers of possibility that linger even in devastation. The apartment felt emptier now, yet paradoxically more alive. I wandered through rooms with a new awareness, noticing sunlight hitting surfaces, the way shadows moved across walls, the sound of the wind against the windows. I began to journal, capturing fragments of memory, emotion, and reflection, attempting to map the chaos into something comprehensible, something that could be understood not just by me, but someday, perhaps, by someone else who had walked this same treacherous path. Every evening I replayed the night in my mind, every small gesture, every glance, every word. But instead of despair consuming me, I began to understand something deeper. Betrayal was not just a wound inflicted by another. It was a mirror held up to one's own life, reflecting the truths we are unwilling to face, the compromises we make, and the illusions we nurture. I don't know if she realized the depth of the fracture she had caused. Perhaps she did, perhaps she didn't. That no longer mattered. What mattered was the path forward, the reconstruction of a self that had been shattered but not annihilated. I started walking again, slowly, deliberately, through the wreckage of what had been, seeking fragments of meaning, shards of hope that refused to break entirely. And that perhaps is the cruel irony, that in being betrayed, I discovered not only the darkness in her actions but the light within my own capacity to endure, to feel, and ultimately to begin anew. The pain was undeniable, but it was also transformative, a passage into a new reality, one where nothing could be taken for granted, and yet everything was possible. The days after that night blurred into one another, a gray monotony punctuated by sudden flashes of memory that refused to leave me in peace. Every time I saw her, every time she smiled or spoke to me with that effortless warmth, I felt an almost unbearable dissonance, part of me longing for the life we had shared, and another part recoiling in mistrust, suspicion, and hurt. I started noticing the patterns, the subtle choreography of deception that had gone unnoticed for years. The late-night texts, the small, unexplained absences, the way her eyes seemed to dart away whenever I entered a room unexpectedly. At first, I tried to rationalize it, telling myself I was reading too much into things, that perhaps she was simply tired, stressed, or preoccupied. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had shifted, and it wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a rupture in the foundation of everything I had believed. I began documenting every detail obsessively. Times, places, conversations. Even the smallest irregularity felt like a clue in a puzzle I didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. I would sit alone at night, poring over notes, replaying scenes in my mind, imagining scenarios I dared not voice aloud. Each reflection brought a new wave of anger, grief, and disbelief. How could someone I loved so completely, someone I trusted implicitly, choose to betray me? I caught myself scrutinizing her interactions with friends, colleagues, even strangers. Every smile, every laugh, every casual touch became a subject of analysis, a potential confirmation of the truth I feared. I began to see the world through a lens of hyper-awareness, where nothing was innocent and every gesture had meaning. Sleep became impossible, and the nights stretched endlessly, echoing with imagined conversations and silent accusations. The tension between us grew, unspoken but palpable. Our home, once a sanctuary, became a theater of uncertainty. I avoided direct confrontation at first, fearing the eruption of emotion I could not control. Instead, I watched, waited, and listened. I learned to read the subtle shifts in her voice, the fleeting expressions that revealed what her words concealed. I was learning to see her in a way I never had before, not as a partner, but as a mystery that might never be fully understood. Then came the moments I could no longer ignore. I would walk past her room and catch the faint smell of another's cologne. I found receipts for dinners, tickets, and gifts that were never mentioned, carefully hidden from view. Each discovery cut like a knife, a reminder that the life I thought I shared with her was a carefully constructed illusion, one that had been maintained at my expense. I confronted her cautiously, testing the waters, trying to gauge her response. At first, she deflected, laughed it off, and offered reassurances that felt hollow to me. I wanted to believe her, to cling to the remnants of trust, but the evidence I held in my own hands contradicted every word she spoke. The confrontation escalated slowly, tension building like a storm, each question I asked opening a door to deeper confusion and pain. Her answers were evasive, deliberate. She smiled, sometimes softly, sometimes with a trace of impatience, as though my insistence on truth was an intrusion she found tedious. I felt a rage I had never known before, a mixture of sorrow, betrayal, and disbelief. How could she stand there, look me in the eyes, and speak with such calm, knowing that the ground beneath us was crumbling? In those weeks, I became almost a stranger to myself. I wandered through the city aimlessly, seeking distraction, clarity, or perhaps a sense of control that eluded me at home. Every street, every cafe, every park became a stage for my inner turmoil. I imagined confrontations, apologies, explanations, none of which ever materialized, yet each shaped my understanding of the fractured reality I now inhabited. I began to question everything I had believed about love, trust, and commitment. Was it possible that all our years together had been a lie? Or was it simply that people are not what we imagine them to be, that our idealized visions of one another are illusions we cling to until the harsh light of truth illuminates the cracks? These questions haunted me, unrelenting, forcing me to confront my own vulnerabilities, my own blind spots. Then came the night when everything became unavoidable. I returned home earlier than expected, the city's lights casting long shadows across the streets. I had intended only to surprise her, to test my own fears, but what I found changed everything. She was there in our apartment with him. The scene is burned into my memory. The casual ease, the familiarity, the way she looked at him with a warmth that had once been reserved for me alone. I stood frozen, the weight of realization pressing down on me. My body refused to move, my mind a jumble of disbelief, rage, and sorrow. Every argument I had imagined, every accusation, every tear felt suddenly irrelevant, overshadowed by the undeniable truth. She had chosen, and in that choice I saw the collapse of everything I had trusted, everything I had believed in. The days following were a blur of confrontation, withdrawal, and quiet observation. I spoke, we argued, and yet much remained unsaid, hanging between us like a dense fog. I learned to navigate this new landscape of our relationship, where every word, every glance carried the weight of history, betrayal, and unresolved emotion. I became both observer and participant in a life that had shifted irrevocably, forced to reconcile the woman I loved with the woman who had betrayed me. In solitude, I began to explore the depths of my own resilience. I wrote extensively, attempting to capture the raw, chaotic emotions that defined my new reality. Journals filled with questions, reflections, memories, and imaginings became my refuge. Through writing, I sought to make sense of the incomprehensible, to map the contours of my shattered world and find pathways forward. I realized that betrayal is not merely an act, it is a lens through which we come to understand ourselves. It exposes weaknesses, highlights vulnerabilities, and challenges assumptions we hold about loyalty, love, and human nature. It forces confrontation with truths we would rather avoid. Yet in that confrontation, there is the possibility of growth, transformation, and renewed understanding. One evening, sitting alone in our living room, I allowed myself to truly feel the weight of what had occurred. Tears came, unbidden and relentless, but with them came clarity. The life I had known was gone. irrevocably altered, yet the life I could build from the fragments remained. I understood in that quiet, painful moment that endurance was not passive. It required courage, insight, and the willingness to face the darkness without flinching. Slowly, I began to reconstruct a sense of self that had been fractured by betrayal. I sought solace in work, in friends, in the rhythms of daily life. I explored interests I had neglected, reconnected with passions long abandoned. The process was neither quick nor easy, yet each small step reaffirmed the capacity for renewal that exists within even the most shattered of hearts. And through it all, I learned that love, even when broken, is not merely a source of pain. It is a mirror reflecting our own strengths, our own capacity to endure, to forgive, and to grow. Betrayal, devastating though it is, became the catalyst for a deeper understanding of myself, of others, and of the fragile, beautiful complexities of human relationships. By the time the weeks had turned into months, I found a fragile equilibrium. I had not forgotten, nor had I fully healed, but I had learned to live with the fracture, to navigate the pain without being consumed by it. I understood that life, like love, is never fully controllable, never entirely predictable, and that resilience is measured not by avoidance of suffering, but by the capacity to endure, reflect, and ultimately transform it into insight and growth. By the time the first shock of betrayal had settled into a dull, constant ache, I realized that my life had become a careful balancing act between observation and avoidance, confrontation and denial. Every interaction with her required precision, every word measured, every glance calculated. It was exhausting, as though I had become a participant in a silent war, one where the enemy was both outside and inside me, the woman I loved, and the version of myself I had been before the fracture. I began to notice something unexpected, a clarity born from suffering. Betrayal strips everything down to essentials. It leaves you with raw truths, the kind that are too glaring to ignore. I understood, perhaps for the first time, how complacency had enabled this rupture. I had trusted, yes, but I had also assumed, believed without question, ignored the whispers of doubt and intuition that had, in hindsight, been impossible to dismiss. One evening, I decided to leave the apartment for hours, to walk the streets of the city as though I were a stranger to it, to myself. The neon lights reflected on wet pavements, and the hum of distant traffic seemed to echo the restless questions inside my mind. I wandered past cafes, past theaters, past the familiar corners of my own neighborhood, and felt the strangeness of being detached from a life that once felt so secure. I met friends for coffee, people I had ignored in the comfortable cocoon of marriage. Conversations were tentative at first. I struggled to articulate the turmoil within me. But slowly, through shared experiences and the simple act of speaking, I began to reclaim fragments of myself. I realized that while betrayal had devastated my trust, it had also reopened doors I had long left closed. Doors to self-awareness, independence, and renewed engagement with the world. At home, the atmosphere remained tense, almost unbearable at times. She continued to move through our shared spaces with an ease I envied and despised in equal measure. But something had shifted in me. No longer entirely a passive victim of circumstance, I began to reclaim the agency that had been dormant within me. I asked questions directly, insisted on transparency, and demanded accountability, not out of spite, but as an assertion of my own dignity. It was during one such confrontation, tense and quiet, that a subtle but profound change occurred. She hesitated in her usual defenses, faltered slightly, and for the first time I glimpsed the complexity behind her actions, not justification, not excuse, but human fallibility. It was a revelation that stunned me, because it allowed me to see her not merely as a betrayer, but as a person shaped by contradictions, impulses, and mistakes. I started to reflect on the nature of love itself, the ways in which attachment can blind, and how betrayal, though devastating, often exposes uncomfortable truths. I wrote pages in my journal, each entry a careful excavation of my emotions, thoughts, and memories. The act of writing became ritual, a method of understanding that brought both clarity and catharsis. Through words, I confronted the hurt, anger, and confusion, numbing them with precision and honesty. There was a moment when I realized that the future we had imagined, our life together as it had been, was gone. The life we could rebuild would be different, irrevocably altered by the choices made, by the breach of trust. Accepting this was both painful and liberating. I understood that clinging to the past would only prolong suffering. Letting go, even partially, offered the possibility of growth and transformation. I began to explore the contours of this new reality. I found solace in solitary walks, in the quiet hum of kafuz, in the companionship of books and music that resonated with the turbulence in my mind. Each small act of self-care, each moment of introspection, became a testament to resilience. I was learning to live alongside betrayal, not as a victim defined by it, but as a person reshaped and strengthened through its consequences. Conversations with her evolved slowly, cautiously. I no longer approached them with the same mixture of fear and desperation. Instead, I sought understanding, clarity, and honesty. She responded in kind, tentatively at first, then with increasing openness. We discussed the fracture in our relationship, the moments that had led to it, and the emotions that had remained unspoken. It was painful, sometimes unbearable, but necessary. In these discussions, I discovered nuances I had not anticipated. Her choices were not born of malice alone, but of loneliness, confusion, and unmet needs. This realization did not erase the betrayal, nor did it lessen the hurt, but it did allow me to frame the experience differently, to understand the human complexity behind actions that had once seemed incomprehensible. The turning point came unexpectedly. One rainy evening, as I sat alone in the apartment, I realized that I had been holding on to anger not only at her, but at myself. I had blamed my own trust, my own vulnerability, and the life I had imagined as though I were responsible for its collapse. A quiet epiphany washed over me. Betrayal, while inflicted externally, is processed internally, and only by reclaiming my own narrative could I move forward. I started to make deliberate choices about the life I wanted to lead. I reconnected with old friends, pursued personal projects, and rediscovered passions that had lain dormant beneath the weight of routine and domesticity. Every step was a small victory, a reclamation of identity that had been overshadowed by grief and doubt. The emotional landscape was still jagged, filled with reminders of loss, of trust shattered. Yet within the jaggedness, I found opportunities for reflection, growth, and resilience. I realized that life, in its most brutal moments, also contains the seeds of renewal. The very act of enduring, reflecting, and choosing how to respond became a form of empowerment. I learned to navigate the delicate balance between acknowledging pain and cultivating hope. The apartment, once a site of tension and suspicion, became a space for reflection and self-discovery. I maintained boundaries, asserted needs, and cultivated emotional clarity. Slowly, the relationship itself transformed, not entirely healed, perhaps not fully repaired, but redefined by honesty, self-awareness, and deliberate choice. I also recognized that betrayal had revealed aspects of human behavior I had not previously considered. People act according to impulses, fears, and desires that may be incomprehensible to those around them. Understanding this is not the same as condoning it. It is a recognition of the complexity of human motivation, a framework for empathy without erasing accountability. Through months of reflection, I began to see the trajectory of my own life beyond the immediate trauma. I imagined possibilities previously obscured by pain, paths that were mine to choose. I became acutely aware that the fracture, devastating though it was, had created space for self-determination, for the pursuit of authenticity, and for the conscious shaping of a future that was no longer dictated solely by shared history. In these moments of solitude and reflection, I realized something profound. Betrayal had been both a destroyer and a teacher. It had torn down illusions, exposed vulnerabilities, and forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Yet in its wake, it offered clarity, insight, and the opportunity to reclaim agency over a life that had been destabilized. I understood that while pain is inevitable in the human experience, the way we navigate it defines us. We can allow betrayal to consume us, or we can use it as a catalyst for self-discovery and transformation. I chose the latter, not to forget, not to absolve, but to reclaim my own narrative and forge a path forward with awareness, resilience, and purpose. By the time I reached the 4th month since the night that shattered everything, I had begun to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, a fragile sense of clarity. The raw, explosive emotion that had consumed me in the early days had transformed into something quieter, steadier, a combination of understanding, resilience, and a strange, aching acceptance. I no longer saw her purely as the source of my suffering, nor myself as a passive victim. Instead, I saw a world reshaped by truth, one where I could finally navigate life with my eyes open. She had changed too, though subtly. The bravado and casual detachment that had once masked her guilt began to soften into something more human, more real. We still shared moments of tension, but there were also brief flashes of the woman I had loved, glimpses of a connection that existed despite everything. It was precarious, delicate, but alive in ways I hadn't thought possible after such a fracture. One evening, I found myself sitting on the balcony, staring at the city lights, the hum of traffic below mingling with the distant murmur of conversations. I had brought my journal, the one that had become both confessional and lifeline over the past months. I flipped through pages filled with pain, anger, self-doubt, and reflection. But now, interspersed among the grief, I noticed passages that spoke of growth, understanding, and determination. I realized then that I had emerged from the storm with something precious, a sense of agency over my own life. The final confrontation with her did not arrive as a dramatic explosion, as I had imagined in my darkest fantasies. It was quiet, deliberate, and profoundly human. We sat in the living room, the evening light casting long shadows across the floor. I spoke first, not accusingly, not angrily, but with honesty and a steady voice. I told her what I had seen, what I had felt, and what I had learned about myself in the aftermath. I spoke of betrayal, yes, but also of resilience, self-discovery, and the understanding that emerged from pain. She listened, for the first time truly listened. There were no evasions, no deflections, only acknowledgement. She did not excuse her actions, nor did I forgive lightly. But there was an unspoken agreement. The past could not be undone, yet the future remained uncertain, open to conscious choice. That night we shared a long, quiet conversation, exploring the fractures, the truths, and the possibilities that lay ahead. It was exhausting and raw, but necessary. In the days that followed, I made deliberate choices about how to live. I engaged with my work more intentionally, reconnecting with projects that had once ignited my passion. I reached out to friends I had neglected, rebuilt relationships that had been overshadowed by domestic routine, and found solace in the simple joys of life: reading, walking, observing the world with unclouded eyes. Each step, each small action, reinforced my sense of self, my understanding that life could continue differently but meaningfully. She and I continued to coexist in our shared space, navigating the awkward, tender terrain of post-betrayal life. There were moments of tension, of old wounds surfacing unexpectedly, but there were also moments of genuine connection, where we saw each other not as adversaries or deceivers, but as flawed human beings learning to live with the consequences of their choices. It was imperfect, fragile, yet suffused with a sense of honesty previously absent. I began to reflect on the lessons that betrayal had imparted. First, that trust, once broken, could be examined, understood, and rebuilt, but only through conscious effort, self-awareness, and accountability. Second, that human actions are rarely simple. Motivations are complex, often contradictory, and rarely align neatly with morality or expectation. And third, that resilience is not merely enduring pain, but transforming it into insight, growth, and intentional living. In solitude, I often revisited the night I had first discovered her betrayal. I recalled the shock, the grief, the rage, and the despair. And yet, I now recognized that those emotions, as painful as they were, had catalyzed a transformation. I had confronted uncomfortable truths, navigated the jagged edges of my psyche, and emerged with a clearer understanding of myself and the world around me. Betrayal had been devastating, yes, but it had also been instructive, revealing the strength and depth I did not know I possessed. Months passed, and life gradually shifted from mere survival to conscious engagement. I developed new routines, explored interests long abandoned, and cultivated relationships that nurtured rather than depleted me. The apartment, once a site of suspicion and tension, became a space of reflection and deliberate living. I learned to enjoy quiet moments alone, to find meaning in observation, creation, and thoughtful engagement with the world. Our relationship, though forever altered, settled into a new equilibrium. We spoke with honesty, set boundaries, and navigated intimacy cautiously but sincerely. It was no longer the effortless love of the past, nor the heated, fragile connection of early confrontation. It was something new, deliberate, conscious, and tempered by the knowledge of human fallibility. It was, in its own way, a kind of rebirth. In the final reckoning, I realized that betrayal, while a rupture, had not defined the entirety of my life. It had been a catalyst, a moment that forced me to confront truths, reassess values, and rebuild from the ruins. I had been forced to see myself and others with unflinching clarity, to navigate pain with courage, and to embrace the uncertainty of life with awareness. And then one morning I walked through the city, feeling the sun on my face, listening to the murmur of life around me, and understood something profound. Life is not a straight path, nor is it free from suffering, but it is rich, complex, and full of possibility, even after betrayal. The fracture had altered my trajectory, yes, but it had not extinguished my capacity to hope, to love cautiously, and to live fully. In that moment, I felt a quiet gratitude for survival, for insight, and for the chance to rebuild a life informed not only by joy, but by the wisdom that pain imparts. The world felt both fragile and expansive, and I understood that the choices I made moving forward, grounded in self-awareness and integrity, would define the life I had reclaimed. Betrayal had torn open a wound, yes, but it had also illuminated a path forward. The night that had once seemed like the end of everything had become, in retrospect, the beginning of a deeper understanding, a testament to resilience, and an opportunity to reconstruct life with eyes wide open. I was no longer the same man who had discovered the betrayal months ago. I had been fractured, yes, but in that fracture, I found the possibility of reinvention, self-discovery, and purposeful living. And as I moved forward, I carried both the memory of pain and the knowledge that even in devastation, life could be reclaimed, reshaped, and embraced with courage and clarity. The fracture remained, a scar etched into the landscape of my life, but it no longer hurt as sharply. It served as a reminder that human connections are delicate, that trust is sacred, and that even in the darkest moments there is a path to renewal should one choose to walk it. And so I did.